Well, hello. Welcome to another session of Be Kinetic. Today was an interesting day for me as I was chatting with an executive of a large corporation as he was sharing his frustration as literally over a decade he has been investing in his leaders to try to be more effective in how they run their company. And his frustration at the end of the day is because he still is not seeing the results that he is really looking for. And I think there's a distinct reason for this is from the dawn of mankind is that we have had people in authority, and typically it must probably started off with kings, and they would have their subjects, and whether you like the king or not is you had to obey his rule. And then there was a shift that took place, and predominantly is in the Industrial Revolution, but the theory, the understanding of interacting with people pretty much remained the same. Is the boss, the owner of the company was exactly that, is he was the boss. And there was something of a leadership understanding, a theory which they called the great man theory, that this was the person in charge. And this was reinforced in the Industrial Revolution, where basically everything was on a process line. So if you wanted to build a car, there was a factory and it would start with certain parts and they would be assembled, and there was this process, there was this system, and as long as the system and the process was working, you were getting the outcome that you were looking for. And because of this predominant mindset of this great man, the person in charge, too often that we found the concept of what we use today as management, is that just as you would manage the process of making a car, we would also manage the people element within working in that factory. And as long as people did their jobs, as long as they fulfilled their roles and responsibilities, everyone should be happy. But unfortunately, what we soon found out is that if everything was working well, the boss was usually happy, but it didn't mean that the people, the workers that were part of this process, that they were happy. And so what we started to find is that in the early about 1920s, as people started to look at the dynamics to go, how do we get the best performance out of our people? Is there a way to get a greater sense of buy-in and commitment without having this forced autocratic approach? And what we saw is that for the first time that there started to be a shift to the notion of what we call leadership today. And then we saw some introductions of the Maslow, I'm sure many of you have heard that, the hierarchy of needs. We started to discuss, to investigate that people need more than a salary. And then Hertzberg came and reinforced this theory with these hygiene factors, and then Kurtz and Lewin, they started to look at the difference or the shift between the autocratic towards democratic leadership. And so what we noticed is that there was this movement away from a management mindset towards a leadership approach. Now, in the early 80s, there was something of an understanding that management was wrong, that there's a belief system because we saw the ill effects of management. Now, in my opinion, there is nothing wrong with management if you understand what management is about. We need good managers. And management is all about managing budgets, managing processes, managing communication, managing systems. And if you don't have someone that is looking after those factors, typically things start to fall apart. So it is essential to run a company, to run an organization, that we have those elements in place. However, people don't like to be managed. We are not systems. We are not processes. We are not things. We are not budgets. We are people. And so it is great to manage things, but it is really ineffective to try and manage people. So we manage things and we lead people. And for me, it's really disappointing that literally in the last 80 or so years is that there's been so much emphasis on leadership, and there's been so many books and teachings and just an overexposure of the reality of the difference leadership is towards management. And the companies that have applied leadership principles, we can see how they have just soared, and the commitment and the buy-in of the people, the motivation and the inspiration that they have is just completely at another level compared to companies that are typically managed. But for me, what is disappointing as a consultant is I am surprised that in spite of the amount of material, in spite of the amount of knowledge when it comes to leadership, is how many companies I engage with that still have a management philosophy. Is that when you've got your senior executives, your managers, your supervisors, is they still so often tell people what to do. They still have this mentality of people need to be supervised. And so what we find, and that's what Gallup found, is in their studies that 87% of people working in modern organizations are disengaged, that they are not bringing their full self to their companies, to their work. And how unfortunate. And the reason being is because there's still this predominant, in spite of all the information, in spite of all the literature, in spite of all the assessments and the outcomes, is that there's still this prevailing response way of doing things that has this management hat that people are wearing. And yet the people who have adopted a leadership approach, a leadership philosophy, are just functioning at a whole different level. Now, as great as this is the people who've made this leadership transition have these extraordinary results, I'm convinced that it's still short of one dynamic. And I'm so glad that the concept, and particularly starting with David Rock, that is really coming into organizations today, is the understanding of neuroleadership. And so what we see that even within leadership theories is that there was the whole idea around what are the traits of a leader. And so they started to look at the qualities of exceptional leaders. And then the behavioral approach in the 1970s, where we would start to look at what are the behaviors, the way in which leaders interact with people that really make them effective. And then the situational model came into play, where we not only looked at their behaviors, but what were the different dynamics of the situations that they experienced. And again, all of these theories have had a profound impact on our ability to be more effective. But to really be on the cutting edge, to really have the effectiveness that we are looking for, if we are not asking ourselves the fundamental question, what drives human behavior? What is it that makes people tick? What is it that causes people to make the decisions they make? Is it will always hamper our ability. And what we find is that with all these theories and all these characteristics and all these behaviors and all of these traits, is sometimes they are not being used in a way that is getting to the root of human behavior because we don't understand it. And so I can be extremely charismatic. I can have the greatest vision. I can have just the nicest personality. But if I don't understand what drives people's behavior, and I'm not tapping into that, I'm not influencing that, is I'm still going to be frustrated to the degree of my effectiveness. And so the whole concept that I really want to encourage you to start to think about is, firstly, do you still have a management approach? And if you do, I really want to urge you to start to grapple with the notion of leadership. And if you have a leadership approach, that's fantastic, and I'm sure you're celebrating the results that you have right now. But if you really want to just take it to another notch, is we want to start to ask the question, what drives human behavior? And in our previous session, if I recall correctly, it would have been in session 2, is that we looked at what really drives people's behavior is their belief system. And you're welcome to go back to that session and have a look at that, is because what we believe ultimately drives what we think and feel, which drives our behaviors. And so if we have a leadership mindset, and that is my concern, and I agree with all of it, but if you go read the average book today, when it comes to leadership, it's the 7 laws. It's the 21 irrefutable principles. And all of these are action-based. They're behavior-based. If we can just get the right behaviors, we'd get the right results. And I agree with that, but it's missing a step. It's missing a fundamental. And if we're not tapping into that, we're going to be putting in a lot of work and a lot of effort. And I think many of you have experienced this, is that there's something of resorting to rewards and to discipline. And why is that? Is because we're not getting into that internal motivation where there's something of this is coming from myself. And so we're trying to lead people by having the right behaviors, by trying to be these perfect leaders, but then we're still not getting the results. Why? Because we haven't transferred our knowledge into their belief system. And so we're trying to change people's behavior. We're trying to get them motivated. We're trying to get them to perform better. We're trying to get them to buy into us as leaders, into the company. But if we're not shifting their beliefs, we're going to continue to struggle. And so I love the 7 laws. I love the 7 principles, the 5 steps, the 3 strategies. They're all fantastic, and I agree with all of them. But yet, if you only have that in your arsenal when it comes to leadership, you're still going to be missing something. And that is the ability to influence people's beliefs. And so I want to encourage you that as we keep going in the months to come, is that we're going to be exploring what does it mean to be a narrow leader? How do we go from management to leadership to being even more effective by being a narrow leader, because we're getting into the very heart of people's decision making, which is ultimately driving their behavior, and that is their beliefs. I am so looking forward to the sessions that we're going to have as we grapple with these concepts so that it makes more sense to us and that we will have practical handles. So looking forward to that. You must have a great day further.
Cut. That was great. That was great. Okay.